She had learned how to live with silence without expecting anything from it. Over time, silence stopped feeling empty and began to feel familiar, almost protective, as if believing she was alone required less courage than hoping and being disappointed again. It became easier to accept solitude than to question it. There were days when the world felt distant, as if life were happening just beyond her reach. She moved through routines, spoke when necessary, fulfilled responsibilities, yet something inside her remained untouched, unseen, quietly waiting. It wasn't sadness that defined those days, but a subtle disconnection she could never fully explain. Loneliness did not arrive with drama or intensity. It settled gradually, woven into ordinary moments. In the empty chair across from her. In the pauses between conversations. In the way her thoughts returned to her without response. It became part of the background of her life. She told herself she was strong enough this way. That independence was safer than connection. That relying only on herself meant fewer fractures and less vulnerability. Over time, this belief hardened into habit, and habit disguised itself as peace. She stopped questioning it. But at night, when the world quieted and distractions faded, something surfaced gently. Not despair, not panic, but a soft ache that lingered beneath everything else. It wasn't loud enough to demand attention, but it was constant enough to be felt. It was the ache of absence. She wondered when she had stopped expecting support. When she had accepted that walking alone was simply how life worked. That miracles happened to others, in other circumstances, in stories that did not resemble her own. Somewhere along the way, she had learned to expect less. The loneliness did not make her bitter. It made her tired. Tired of holding everything together without rest. Tired of being the one who listened but was rarely heard. Tired of convincing herself that solitude was the same as strength. She didn't ask for a miracle. She didn't even believe one would come. Expectation felt like a risk she could no longer afford. Instead, she learned to move forward quietly, carrying her own weight, asking little from the world. All she knew was that something inside her longed to be met. Not fixed. Not rescued. Simply acknowledged. And on that ordinary day, one that began exactly like the others before it, she had no idea that her understanding of loneliness was about to change. Because sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive with signs or announcements. Sometimes it doesn't interrupt your life at all. Sometimes, without warning, it simply sits beside you and reminds you that you were never as alone as you believed. Her past had taught her how to normalize absence. Not the absence of people, but the absence of being truly accompanied. She had been surrounded before, yet felt unseen. Supported in words, but not in presence. Over time, she learned not to expect more than what was offered. There were moments she replayed in her mind, moments when she had needed someone to stay, to notice, to choose her without being asked. Those moments didn't end in confrontation or heartbreak. They ended quietly, which somehow made them harder to release. She remembered times when she showed up fully, offering attention, care, understanding, only to realize later that the exchange was uneven. She had been present in other people's lives while slowly disappearing from her own. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity, and clarity carried weight. Her sense of invisibility didn't come from rejection alone. It came from adaptation. From learning to minimize needs so others would stay comfortable. From becoming reliable instead of vulnerable. Strong instead of honest. Over time, she forgot that connection was meant to be mutual. She noticed how often she dismissed her own longing for closeness. How easily she labeled it weakness. How quickly she convinced herself that independence was the more evolved choice. That belief protected her for a while, but it also isolated her. There was grief in recognizing how much she had carried alone. Not because she lacked people, but because she lacked reciprocity. She had learned how to be everything for herself, yet something inside her still ached for shared presence. She moved through life efficiently, responsibly, without asking too many questions. But beneath that competence lived a quiet fatigue, the kind that comes from being emotionally self-sufficient for too long. It wasn't that she didn't want connection. It was that she no longer trusted it to arrive. She didn't dramatize this truth. She accepted it. Acceptance, however, did not erase longing. It simply taught her how to live with it without drawing attention to it. That skill became second nature. She believed this was maturity. She believed this was strength. She didn't yet realize that what she called independence was actually a doorway waiting to be reopened, and that the miracle she never expected was already moving closer, preparing to meet her where she least anticipated it. Her past had quietly taught her how to normalize absence. Not the absence of people around her, but the absence of true companionship. She had been present in rooms filled with voices and still felt unseen. She had heard supportive words that never translated into presence, and over time she learned not to expect more than what was offered. There were memories that surfaced without warning, moments when she had needed someone to stay, to notice, to choose her without being asked. Those moments did not end in dramatic goodbyes or visible rejection. They faded softly, which somehow made them harder to name and even harder to release. She remembered how often she showed up fully for others, offering care, attention, patience, only to realize later that the exchange was uneven. She had been available, dependable, emotionally present, while slowly becoming invisible to herself. That realization did not arrive with anger, but with a heavy clarity that settled deep. Her sense of being unseen did not come only from loss. It came from adaptation. From learning to minimize her needs so that others would remain comfortable. From choosing to be reliable instead of vulnerable, composed instead of honest. Over time, this adjustment became so natural that she stopped noticing it. She began to recognize how often she dismissed her own longing for closeness. How quickly she labeled it weakness. How easily she convinced herself that independence was the wiser, more mature path. That belief protected her for a time, but it also quietly isolated her. There was grief in realizing how much she had carried alone. Not because she lacked people, but because she lacked reciprocity. She had mastered the art of being self-sufficient, yet something inside her still yearned for shared presence, for being met without explanation. She moved through life with efficiency and responsibility, rarely asking for help, rarely pausing to question why things felt heavier than they should. Beneath that competence lived a quiet fatigue, the kind that comes from being emotionally self-reliant for too long. She didn't dramatize this truth. She accepted it. Acceptance became her coping strategy, teaching her how to live with longing without drawing attention to it. That skill became second nature, almost invisible to her. She believed this was maturity. She believed this was strength. And for a long time, she believed that walking alone was simply how life worked. She did not yet realize that what she called independence was actually a threshold waiting to be crossed, and that the miracle she never expected was already approaching, preparing to sit beside her in a way that would quietly redefine everything she thought she knew about being alone. As time passed, she began to notice how deeply the belief of being alone had shaped her choices. It influenced how much she shared, how much she asked for, and how carefully she guarded her expectations. She had learned to move through life without leaning too much on anyone, convinced that this was the safest way to remain steady. She noticed how often she anticipated disappointment before it ever had a chance to appear. How she prepared herself emotionally, not because something had gone wrong, but because something might. This quiet anticipation became a shield, protecting her from hope just as much as it protected her from pain. There were moments when connection brushed close enough to be felt. A conversation that lingered. A presence that felt different. But instead of leaning into those moments, she retreated. Not out of fear, but out of habit. She had learned that expecting less made life easier to manage. She carried her independence with pride, but beneath it lived exhaustion. Independence required constant vigilance. It meant never assuming support would be there, never relaxing into the idea of being held by someone else's care. Over time, this vigilance became tiring, even if she rarely admitted it. She wondered when she had decided that being self-sufficient meant being emotionally closed. When she had equated strength with silence. The realization did not arrive as regret, but as recognition. She could see now how this belief had slowly narrowed her world. Her days continued as usual, yet something felt suspended. As if life were waiting for her to notice something important. The loneliness she felt was no longer just an absence, it had become a question, quietly asking whether this was truly how she wanted to live. She felt the contradiction clearly. She valued her independence, yet longed for shared presence. She trusted herself deeply, yet felt tired of carrying everything alone. These truths existed side by side, unresolved but undeniable. She began to sense that the loneliness she accepted was not her destiny. It was a story she had learned, repeated, and lived into. And like all stories, it could be rewritten, if she was willing to see it for what it was. She didn't yet know what would change or how. She only felt the subtle tension of standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. A place where old beliefs no longer fit, but new ones had not yet taken shape. What she could not see was how close the shift already was. How near the moment that would challenge everything she believed about being alone. Because sometimes, the miracle does not arrive to save us. Sometimes, it arrives to sit beside us, and remind us that we were never meant to carry everything on our own. There were evenings when the stillness around her felt heavier than usual. Not suffocating, but present enough to be noticed. She would sit with her thoughts, aware of how accustomed she had become to handling everything internally, without interruption, without support, without expectation. She noticed how rarely she allowed herself to be seen in her uncertainty. How carefully she chose her words so they wouldn't reveal too much. She had learned that showing strength invited respect, while showing need often invited silence. Over time, she adapted accordingly. Loneliness, she realized, was not always about being physically alone. It was about feeling emotionally unmatched. About carrying questions that had no place to land. About holding space for others while quietly abandoning her own. She thought about how many times she had been the one to listen, to reassure, to remain steady when others faltered. She offered presence generously, believing that this was simply who she was. Yet somewhere along the way, she stopped noticing that her own need for presence went unanswered. Her life looked complete from the outside. Responsibilities were met. Conversations were polite. Days were structured. But beneath that structure lived a quiet absence, the absence of being met where she stood, without explanation or effort. She felt this absence most strongly in moments of transition. At the end of long days. In pauses between tasks. In the spaces where she might have leaned into someone else's presence, had she believed it would be there. She didn't resent the world for this. She didn't feel angry or defeated. She simply accepted it as the cost of being self-reliant. Yet acceptance did not erase longing. It only taught her how to carry it silently. She wondered, briefly, what it would feel like to not be the strongest one in the room. To rest in someone else's awareness. To not have to explain or justify her tiredness. That thought lingered longer than she expected. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet wondering was not weakness. It was readiness. The loneliness she had lived with for so long was no longer asking to be endured. It was asking to be answered. And somewhere, unseen and unexpected, the answer was already moving toward her, not to overwhelm her life, not to rescue her, but to sit beside her in a way that would gently, irrevocably, change how she understood being alone. The moment didn't announce itself as important. It arrived disguised as routine, wrapped in an ordinary day that looked no different from the ones before it. She wasn't searching for connection, and she certainly wasn't expecting anything to change. She was simply moving through her day, present but guarded, open but cautious. She chose a familiar place, one that required no explanation. Somewhere neutral, where she could sit without being noticed, surrounded by movement that didn't demand participation. It felt safer that way. She settled in, carrying the quiet weight she had grown used to, unaware that something unseen was already aligning. That was when she noticed the presence beside her. Not intrusive. Not demanding. Just there. A calm, steady energy that didn't ask her to perform or adjust. It wasn't the kind of presence that fills space loudly. It filled it gently. She didn't look right away. She didn't need to. There was something unmistakable about the feeling of not being alone in the way she had been before. It wasn't relief. It was recognition. As if something familiar had returned without explanation. Her thoughts slowed. The internal monologue that usually kept her company softened, replaced by a stillness that felt different from solitude. This stillness did not echo. It held. She became aware of how relaxed her body felt in that moment. No tension in her shoulders. No need to prepare for disappointment. She wasn't bracing herself for connection or withdrawal. She was simply present, sharing space without expectation. When she finally acknowledged the presence beside her, there was no dramatic exchange. No profound words. No visible sign that something meaningful was happening. And yet, something inside her shifted unmistakably. She realized then how rare it was to feel accompanied without being evaluated. To exist next to someone without needing to explain herself. This quiet companionship felt unfamiliar, almost forgotten, yet deeply right. She didn't label it a miracle. She didn't search for meaning in it. She simply allowed the moment to exist. And in allowing it, she felt something soften that she hadn't realized was still guarded. What she couldn't yet see was that this moment, so ordinary on the surface, was already rewriting the story she had been telling herself about loneliness. Because sometimes, the miracle doesn't arrive to fix anything. Sometimes, it arrives to sit beside you, and stay long enough for you to remember what being accompanied feels like. She didn't try to define what was happening. She had learned that naming things too quickly often stripped them of their truth. Instead, she stayed with the feeling, allowing it to exist without analysis. The presence beside her asked nothing of her, and that alone felt extraordinary. She noticed how different this felt from other moments of connection she had known. There was no urgency to speak, no pressure to impress, no subtle negotiation of roles. She wasn't being measured or interpreted. She was simply allowed to be where she was. This quiet companionship reached places words never had. It softened the part of her that had learned to brace itself. It reassured the part of her that had grown tired of carrying everything alone. Without effort, without intention, something inside her began to rest. She realized how long it had been since she had felt this kind of ease in shared space. Not excitement, not intensity, but steadiness. A sense that nothing was required for the moment to be valid. That realization stirred something gentle and unexpected within her. Her breathing slowed. Her thoughts loosened their grip. The familiar internal vigilance faded, replaced by a subtle openness she hadn't experienced in a long time. She felt present not just in the moment, but in herself. She understood then that loneliness had taught her to be self-contained, but it had also taught her to stay guarded. This presence did not ask her to dismantle those walls immediately. It simply showed her that walls were no longer necessary here. There was no conversation that needed to happen for this moment to matter. No explanation that would make it more real. What mattered was the feeling of being accompanied without condition, without expectation, without agenda. She sensed how deeply this simple act of sitting beside someone was reaching her. It wasn't filling a void. It was reminding her that the void had never been permanent. It had only been waiting for recognition. She didn't know what this moment would become. She didn't wonder how long it would last. For the first time in a long while, she didn't reach ahead of herself. She stayed. And in staying, she felt something fundamental shift. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But deeply enough to know that the story she had believed about being alone was already changing, quietly, gently, and without resistance. When she eventually left that place, nothing external seemed different. The world moved at the same pace. People passed by as they always had. Yet something within her carried a new weight, not heavy, but grounded. The kind of weight that anchors rather than burdens. She noticed it first in the way she walked. Less guarded. Less hurried. As if her body had registered something her mind was still catching up to. The familiar tension that usually accompanied her steps had loosened, replaced by a quiet steadiness she didn't question. Throughout the day, that sense of being accompanied lingered. Not as memory, but as presence. She didn't replay the moment or search for meaning in it. She simply felt less alone inside her own thoughts. The inner dialogue that once echoed back at her now felt held, less insistent. She realized how deeply the belief of being alone had shaped her perception. How it colored her expectations before she ever entered a room. That belief had softened, not shattered, just enough to let something else breathe. There was a subtle warmth in her chest when she paused during the day. A reminder that connection didn't always need to be earned or explained. Sometimes it arrived quietly, without invitation, simply because it was time. She caught herself responding differently to small moments. She listened more openly. She smiled without effort. She allowed pauses to exist without filling them. These shifts were gentle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable to her. She didn't attribute this change to coincidence or imagination. She trusted the internal evidence. Something real had occurred, something that rearranged how she experienced her own presence in the world. That evening, when she returned home, the silence felt different. Not empty. Not protective. It felt spacious. As if the room itself acknowledged the shift she carried. She sat with that feeling, not trying to prolong it, not fearing its disappearance. For the first time, she trusted that connection didn't have to be clung to in order to remain meaningful. She didn't yet know what this encounter represented. She didn't define it as a miracle. But deep within, she sensed that something essential had been restored. And that quiet restoration would soon reveal itself, not through words or explanations, but through the way her life began to respond from that moment on. In the days that followed, she noticed small shifts that were impossible to dismiss. Nothing dramatic announced itself, yet situations began to unfold with less resistance. Conversations felt easier. Decisions felt clearer. The effort she once applied to simply get through the day softened into something more fluid. She realized that the presence she had felt beside her had not stayed behind. It moved with her, not as a memory, but as a recalibrated way of being. She was no longer bracing herself for absence. She was meeting each moment with a subtle openness that changed how life met her in return. People responded differently to her now. Not because she had changed her behavior intentionally, but because she was no longer holding herself apart. There was a quiet availability in her presence that invited connection without demanding it. That shift felt natural, not learned. She noticed how often she had previously anticipated disappointment before it ever had a chance to appear. That habit began to loosen. Where she once closed herself preemptively, she now allowed moments to unfold before deciding how to respond. This alone transformed her experience of everyday interactions. Her inner world felt steadier. Thoughts that once looped endlessly now found resolution more easily. She wasn't searching for reassurance. She trusted what she felt. The internal dialogue that had long been her only companion became quieter, making space for something gentler. Even moments of solitude felt different. They no longer reinforced the story of being alone. They felt chosen, peaceful, restorative. The distinction mattered more than she realized. Solitude no longer meant isolation. It meant presence with herself. She became aware of how often life offered support in subtle ways. A timely message. An unexpected kindness. A sense of right timing where once there had been frustration. These moments didn't overwhelm her. They confirmed something she already felt. She didn't rush to name what was happening. She allowed it to unfold without interference. The absence of urgency felt like its own sign. Life was responding not to effort, but to alignment. She understood now that the miracle she encountered had not been an interruption. It had been an invitation. An invitation to live as if accompaniment was possible, even when it arrived quietly. And as she accepted that invitation, she felt something settle into place, a knowing that she was no longer moving through life unseen, even when walking alone. As the weeks continued, she became aware of how unfamiliar receiving truly was for her. She had spent so much of her life offering stability, care, and attention that being met without effort felt almost disorienting. Yet instead of resisting it, she allowed herself to remain open. She noticed how this openness softened her boundaries without dissolving them. She didn't lose herself in others. She simply stopped standing apart from them. This balance felt new and deeply grounding, as if she had finally found a way to be both independent and accompanied. Her trust in connection evolved. It no longer required constant proof or reassurance. She trusted the quality of presence rather than its permanence. This shift freed her from clinging or withdrawing, allowing her to stay present without fear. She reflected on how often she had equated vulnerability with weakness. Now she saw it differently. Vulnerability, she realized, was simply the willingness to be seen without armor. And being seen did not diminish her strength, it clarified it. Moments of shared silence became meaningful in a way words never had. She found comfort in coexistence rather than conversation. In knowing someone could be there without needing to fill the space. That realization changed how she valued connection. She felt more grounded in herself. Not because she relied on someone else, but because she no longer resisted support when it appeared. This acceptance stabilized her emotionally, allowing her to move through life with less effort and more coherence. She noticed how her sense of belonging expanded beyond people. It extended into spaces, moments, even time itself. She felt less like an observer and more like a participant in her own life. This shift influenced how she made decisions. She chose from a place of trust rather than protection. She allowed opportunities to unfold without closing herself off prematurely. The results felt aligned, even when uncertain. She didn't analyze these changes excessively. She lived them. Presence had become something she experienced rather than questioned. And that experience reshaped her understanding of what it meant to be accompanied. She sensed that the miracle she once believed would arrive dramatically had instead integrated itself quietly into her life. Not as an event, but as a way of relating. And in learning to receive presence, she discovered that she had been worthy of it all along. She began to notice how deeply the experience of being accompanied had altered her inner landscape. It wasn't that her life had suddenly filled with people or noise. It was that the sense of invisibility she once carried no longer defined her. Something essential had shifted in how she perceived herself. She realized that much of her loneliness had been internalized. Not imposed by circumstance, but shaped by belief. The belief that she had to manage everything alone. That asking for nothing was safer than hoping for something. That belief had softened, and in its place grew a quiet confidence she had never cultivated before. Being seen, she learned, did not require constant attention. It required presence. And that presence had reminded her of parts of herself she had kept guarded for too long. Parts that didn't need fixing, only acknowledgement. She noticed how her voice felt steadier now. Not louder, not more assertive, just clearer. She expressed herself without over-explaining. She trusted that what she felt was enough. This clarity simplified her interactions and strengthened her sense of self. Her emotional world became less reactive. She no longer interpreted distance as rejection or silence as absence. She allowed space to exist without assigning it meaning. This ease felt liberating, like releasing a tension she hadn't known she was holding. She understood now that connection begins internally. The moment she stopped treating herself as alone, life reflected that shift back to her. Support appeared naturally, not because she demanded it, but because she allowed it to exist. This new understanding reshaped her expectations. She no longer anticipated disappointment before possibility. She met moments as they came, trusting her ability to remain open without losing herself. She felt more integrated. Less divided between strength and softness. Less torn between independence and longing. These qualities no longer contradicted each other. They coexisted, balanced and whole. She didn't feel the need to name what had happened as a miracle. Labels felt unnecessary. What mattered was the lived experience, the steady knowing that she was no longer unseen. And in that knowing, she sensed a new chapter forming quietly. One built not on isolation, but on the deep, sustaining awareness that presence, once received, changes everything. Once she recognized that she was no longer unseen, the loneliness that had once defined her began to lose its authority. It didn't disappear completely, but it no longer dictated her inner climate. It no longer framed every quiet moment as proof of absence. She noticed how differently she now experienced time alone. Silence no longer felt like confirmation of abandonment. It felt neutral, sometimes even nurturing. The echo that once returned her own thoughts back to her now carried warmth instead of emptiness. She became aware that what had changed was not the presence of others, but the relationship she had with herself in the absence of them. She no longer interpreted solitude as evidence that something was missing. It became a space where she could breathe without vigilance. This shift altered how she moved through her days. She was less guarded, less defensive, less prepared for disappointment. She didn't lower her standards or abandon discernment. She simply stopped assuming that distance meant disconnection. Her emotional availability expanded naturally. She listened without bracing. She spoke without preemptive restraint. She allowed moments of closeness to unfold without rehearsing their ending. This openness felt grounded rather than risky. She reflected on how much of her suffering had come from anticipating loneliness before it arrived. That anticipation had shaped her posture, her tone, her expectations. Releasing it gave her back energy she hadn't realized she was spending constantly. Life responded subtly. Interactions felt warmer. Opportunities emerged without force. Support appeared in quiet, ordinary ways. These changes didn't overwhelm her. They felt proportional, appropriate, aligned. She trusted herself within connection now. She no longer feared losing herself or being overlooked. She knew she could remain present without abandoning her center. That confidence changed everything. The miracle she once believed would rescue her had instead re-educated her. It taught her that being accompanied was not something she had to earn or demand. It was something she could allow. And as she allowed it, she understood something deeply transformative. Loneliness had never been her identity. It had only been a chapter, one that was quietly, gently coming to a close. With time, she began to understand that the miracle she experienced was not defined by who sat beside her, but by what that presence awakened within her. It had shifted something fundamental, something that quietly reoriented how she related to herself and to life. She realized that feeling accompanied had allowed her to soften without collapsing. It showed her that openness did not require surrendering strength. On the contrary, it revealed a deeper kind of resilience, one rooted in trust rather than endurance. Her days felt less fragmented now. She moved through them with a sense of continuity, as if the parts of her life that once felt disconnected had begun to align. There was less inner negotiation, less effort spent holding opposing truths together. She noticed how her emotional responses carried more patience. She no longer rushed to interpret or defend. She allowed situations to unfold before assigning meaning. This pause created space for understanding instead of reaction. She felt more attuned to subtle cues, shifts in energy, tone, timing. Where she once ignored these signals to protect herself, she now trusted them to guide her. This awareness felt like a quiet intelligence she had always possessed but never fully used. Connection, she realized, was no longer something external she waited for. It had become an internal orientation. A way of meeting moments with openness, regardless of who was present or absent. This understanding freed her from dependence while preserving intimacy. She reflected on how this change had reshaped her expectations. She no longer anticipated abandonment or disappointment as default outcomes. She allowed possibility to exist without immediately preparing for loss. That allowance softened her entire experience of living. The miracle had not erased her past. It reframed it. What once felt like evidence of being alone now appeared as preparation, a long apprenticeship in self-awareness that made this moment possible. She felt gratitude, not loud or celebratory, but steady. Gratitude for the way life had met her quietly, without spectacle, exactly where she was ready to receive. And as this understanding settled, she sensed that the miracle had completed its work, not by changing her circumstances, but by changing the meaning she carried within them. She began to notice how naturally this new awareness followed her into every space she entered. Not as a reminder of what had happened, but as a quiet confidence that stayed with her. She no longer scanned rooms for signs of absence. She arrived already grounded. Her posture changed in subtle ways. She took up space without effort. She listened without disappearing. She spoke without shrinking. These shifts were not strategic. They were the natural result of no longer believing she had to manage everything alone. She realized that being accompanied did not mean being constantly joined by someone else. It meant knowing that presence was possible, that support existed beyond her constant vigilance. That knowing softened her internal world in ways nothing else ever had. Moments that once triggered the old ache now passed gently. Silence no longer pressed against her chest. Distance no longer signaled rejection. She trusted that connection did not vanish simply because it wasn't visible in every moment. She reflected on how much energy she had spent preparing for loneliness before it arrived. That preparation had shaped her expectations and narrowed her experience. Releasing it gave her back a sense of ease she hadn't known she was missing. Her life didn't suddenly fill with certainty or answers. It filled with steadiness. A steadiness that allowed her to move forward without constantly checking behind her. She trusted the ground beneath her now. The miracle had not altered her circumstances dramatically. It had altered her orientation. She no longer approached life from a place of lack. She met it from a place of quiet sufficiency. She felt connected even in moments of solitude. Not because someone was always there, but because she no longer interpreted solitude as abandonment. It became a neutral space, sometimes even a nourishing one. She understood then that the miracle was not an event she could point to. It was a shift she lived inside of. A reorientation that stayed with her long after the moment itself had passed. And in that understanding, she realized something profound: she had not lost connection before. She had simply forgotten that it could arrive gently, sit beside her, and remind her that she was never meant to carry everything alone. What surprised her most was not how the moment had changed her, but how it stayed. Long after the presence beside her was no longer physically there, the feeling of being accompanied remained. It settled into her days quietly, becoming part of how she moved through the world. She noticed that she no longer rushed to fill empty spaces. Pauses felt natural now. Silence no longer demanded interpretation. It simply existed, and she existed within it without tension. This ease was new, and it felt earned. Her inner dialogue softened. The voice that once reminded her to be careful, to expect little, to stay guarded, lost its urgency. In its place grew a steadier awareness that she was supported in ways she didn't need to monitor constantly. She trusted herself more deeply. Not because she had all the answers, but because she knew she could remain present even when uncertainty appeared. That trust made her feel less fragile and more grounded in her own experience. She reflected on how the miracle had not added anything external to her life. It had not promised permanence or protection. Instead, it had removed a belief that no longer served her, the belief that she was fundamentally alone. This realization changed how she related to challenges. She met them without the old sense of isolation. Even difficult moments felt shared somehow, as if life itself was leaning in rather than pulling away. She carried this understanding into her choices. She no longer chose from fear of being abandoned or overlooked. She chose from alignment, trusting that connection did not require her to diminish herself or stay guarded. The miracle had not given her certainty. It had given her companionship with herself. And that companionship made every other connection feel less urgent and more authentic. She sensed that this was not a chapter she would close and move past. It was a foundation she would continue to live from. A quiet shift that would shape how she experienced presence, intimacy, and belonging. And as she moved forward, steady and attentive, she knew one thing clearly: even when no one sat beside her, she was no longer alone in the way she once believed. As time passed, she began to notice how life itself responded differently to her presence. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a subtle consistency that felt intentional. Situations unfolded with less friction. Encounters felt timely. Moments aligned without being forced. She realized that the shift had not happened outside of her. It had happened in the way she now met the world. She was no longer approaching life from the posture of someone bracing for absence. She arrived open, attentive, grounded. And life met her there. She felt less urgency to prove, explain, or secure her place. There was a quiet confidence in knowing she belonged without negotiation. That confidence changed the tone of her interactions, allowing them to unfold naturally rather than defensively. She noticed how often support appeared in small, ordinary ways. A conversation that landed exactly when needed. A kindness that required no explanation. A sense of right timing that replaced the old feeling of being out of sync. These moments felt gentle, yet deeply affirming. Her intuition felt clearer now. Not louder, not demanding, but steady. She trusted it without argument. That trust guided her choices, helping her move toward what felt aligned and away from what quietly drained her. She no longer interpreted challenges as signs of abandonment. Difficulty no longer confirmed her old story. Instead, she met obstacles with curiosity, trusting that even resistance carried information rather than rejection. She reflected on how differently she now experienced uncertainty. It no longer felt threatening. It felt like space for something to emerge without being forced into shape. This relationship with the unknown softened her entire inner world. Life no longer felt like something she had to endure alone. It felt like a conversation she was finally participating in fully. Not because someone else took responsibility for her path, but because she allowed herself to be met along it. She understood now that the miracle had changed her orientation, not her circumstances. And that orientation reshaped everything else quietly, steadily, without announcement. As she continued forward, She carried this knowing with her. When she stopped assuming she was alone, life stopped responding as if she were. She no longer searched for proof of what had changed. The need for confirmation had dissolved on its own. What remained was a quiet knowing that moved with her, shaping her days without effort. She felt accompanied not by a presence she could point to, but by a trust that had taken root inside her. She noticed how gently she now held herself. There was less self-judgment, less pressure to perform strength. She allowed herself to feel without immediately managing or correcting the feeling. This permission felt like relief, like returning to something she had forgotten was possible. Her relationship with others shifted naturally. She no longer leaned in from hunger or held back from fear. She met people where she stood, grounded and open, without expectation or defense. This balance made her connections feel more real, more mutual. She realized that what once felt like loneliness had been a signal, not a sentence. A signal pointing her toward a deeper relationship with presence, with receptivity, with herself. Now that she had listened, the signal no longer needed to shout. She moved through quiet moments with ease. Silence no longer carried meaning that needed to be decoded. It simply existed, and she existed within it comfortably. This ease became one of the clearest signs of how deeply the miracle had integrated. She trusted life differently now. Not because she believed nothing would go wrong, but because she trusted her ability to remain connected even when things were uncertain. That trust softened her resistance and expanded her capacity to receive. She understood that the miracle had not rescued her from solitude. It had transformed solitude into something else entirely. A space of presence rather than absence. A place where she could rest without feeling unseen. This understanding followed her quietly, without urgency or demand. It shaped her decisions, her pace, her willingness to stay open. It reminded her that being accompanied did not require constant evidence. And as she continued forward, steady and grounded, she knew this much was true: the miracle that once sat beside her had not left. It had become part of how she lived, part of how she met the world, part of how she understood herself. She looked back now and understood that the miracle had never been about someone appearing beside her. It had been about something awakening within her. A remembrance. A quiet correction of a story she had lived inside for too long. She saw how deeply she had believed that being strong meant being solitary, that moving forward required carrying everything alone. That belief had shaped her choices, her expectations, her posture toward life. And yet, it was never the truth, only a version she adopted to survive. The miracle did not erase her independence. It softened it. It showed her that strength and connection were not opposites. That presence could exist without obligation. That being accompanied did not mean losing herself, but finally meeting herself fully. She understood now that loneliness was never proof of abandonment. It was a signal. A call inward. An invitation to open rather than close. Once she listened, the signal no longer needed to repeat itself. Life felt different because she felt different inside it. She no longer walked as if she were unseen. She no longer braced for absence. She moved with the quiet certainty that connection was possible, even when it arrived gently, even when it didn't announce itself. She realized that miracles don't always arrive to change our circumstances. Sometimes, they arrive to change our orientation. To sit beside us long enough for us to remember that we were never meant to carry everything alone. What stayed with her was not a moment, but a knowing. A knowing that presence can be felt even in silence. That support can exist even when it isn't visible. That being accompanied begins the moment we stop telling ourselves we are alone. And if this story reaches you now, it is not by chance. Perhaps it is here to remind you of something you've forgotten too. That the same quiet miracle that sat beside her is available to you. Not to rescue you. Not to fix you. But to meet you, exactly where you are. You were never meant to walk alone. And you never truly did.